I'm excited now to introduce our MC for the remainder of our time together. Jonathan King is another one of our fabulous board members. He has been on the board for over 8 years. And what I appreciate about Jonathan is he's contributed greatly to how we have connected economics to childcare. Jonathan's the founder and owner of Halcyon Consulting, where he provides organizational leadership and economic consulting. We're so thankful that Halcyon Consulting is one of our great sponsors for today, and please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
Hey, it's great to be here today, but you're too quiet. I mean, you're all really respectful, but the fact of the matter is you're too quiet. So we need to get this room buzzing a little bit. So before we start the first panel, we're gonna get you buzzing a little bit. So it says here in my notes, which I actually think are like, this part is like the same notes as from Summit 2. It says, as an economist with particular interest in the economic impact of early childhood investments in our state, and as a Thread board member, I'm happy to be your MC today. Yes, this is true. But since that was written, I have gone from being an economist 100% of the time to being a leadership and organizational change coach about 80% of the time, and an economist 20% of the time. So I get to do fun things like this now. Yes, thank you, Kevin, who's part of the cabal. Kevin's happy to have me gone from the local economics scene because now he's the guy, which thank you, Kevin, for being the guy. All right, so as a coach, I come at everything from a place of change. How do we make change? What's the change that you need? Why does it matter? What are you going to do to get there? Right? And that's the mentality that we have to have as we think about this field, because there's a ton of challenges in this field and we know it. It's been, many of these challenges are the same challenges as when we first started working together, right? Now some of them are worse, some of them are better, but I want you to think about the change that you want to make and how you are going to make it. So I'm going to challenge you twice today to set some intentions. Okay, so I'm going to give you the first one here in a minute, but let me tell a couple of stories. So the first one is, if I go into any kindergarten or first grade class in this state, what am I going to hear? What am I going to hear? I'm going to hear that 70% of the kids aren't showing up social, emotional, ready to learn. They don't have the skills. What's the number one thing that prevents kids from showing up not ready to learn? This sector, high quality early childhood education. That statistic has stayed the same since I got introduced to this field way back in 2013, 2014. That is a huge challenge, and it's a why we need this change, and we are at the intersection of that. If I go out to every employer that I talk to as a coach, what's their number one challenge? Workforce. I don't know if you saw in the paper this morning, but the US economy grew at 4.9% in the third quarter. It is smoking hot. There are more people employed now than at any time in the history of the American Republic. And the unemployment rate is as low as it's been in 50 years, and the youth unemployment is at its highest percentage, as in youth participation is at its highest point ever. It's not that people don't want to work, it's that there aren't enough workers. What's the number one source of the way we could get new workers? Adequate childcare. That's what we're working towards. That's the why. And I've got one last why for you that's a little more personal. I was blessed to go home about 2 weeks ago to see my parents in Vermont. I'm now 50. My parents are now in their late 70s. There's a New England tradition around this time of year, what's called chicken pie supper. And in chicken pie supper is essentially a fall harvest experience, and all the churches put them on, and the local organizations put them on, and you buy your tickets and you go hang out with your peers. This is a great community event, and of course COVID changed that a little bit. They're still getting back to doing it all in person. So my mother and I drove out to the old meeting house out in East Montpelier, Vermont, to pick up chicken pie supper as takeout. And I walked in the door, and who's sitting there but the husband of my daycare provider, my child care provider from when I was 2 or 3. And my mom says, back in the kitchen. She points back in the kitchen. She said, "Sees the woman in pink? That's Diana Fielder." I haven't seen Diana in 20 years, right? So I excuse myself and I go to the kitchen, and of course there's two women in pink. So I wasn't sure which one was Diana. And so I said, "Diana," and she turns around. And I extended my hand and I said, "Jonathan King." And she says, she looks at me and she grabs my head like I'm two and kisses me on the forehead, right? And held my head there and loved me as if I was two again. So when we're building this, we're not just building the economy. We're creating spaces where children can feel like they're loved, and not just for the first 2 years of their life, but the first 50 years of their life, right? And we're working for that too. So with that, I ask you to turn to your neighbor and create some buzz in this room about the change you want to see today. What is it that you want? Come on, this is where you interact with each other, right? I know it's COVID, it's post-COVID, we're all afraid, but interact. All right. Now it's time for me to get back to my script. So I've got another challenge for you at the end of the day, but I'll wait for that one, your intention setting. What is it that you need to get out of today? All right, so now I'm back to my script. All right, so I'm the guy, as I've said this before, I'm the guy that introduces the guys and gals, right? Like that's how it works. So we're gonna continue on with our exciting agenda. We've got 2 back-to-back sessions this morning. Encourage you to use social media as appropriate, but let's dive into our next session. Which is Bridging to the Future, where we'll hear about the latest data about the economic impact of early care and education in Alaska. For this session, we have note cards on the tables for writing your questions, so please write them as you're listening and we'll go around and collect them. Moderating this session will be the Kevin Barry, who has become the preeminent economist in the area. It's great. Every time Kevin writes an op-ed in the paper, I say to myself, why didn't you call me? Because we could have written that together, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, because he's great. Kevin is part of Team Barry, whom he will introduce his wife when he gets up here. You may have seen them in the video. But Kevin is a fellow board member at Thread. We are so thrilled to have him. I'm thrilled to have him because when I term off next year, I know that I'll be replaced. And he's an associate professor of economics at the College of Business and Public Policy at UAA. He recently got some big fancy award, didn't you? Yeah, he did. So with that, Kevin, come on up here and lead this great panel that we've got.
Hi, everybody. So thank you, Jonathan, for bringing the energy this morning. And I want to start off by saying the word cabal, I think, is accurate. I love that. If you go to conferences and workshops and stuff, you've probably seen myself or one of the other 2 people here talk about labor force lately, and eventually start talking about childcare. And it's not just, I think, because we all have kids in childcare, which is why you often don't see myself and my wife together, because somebody has to get the kids to places. But it is an important thing for the entire economy and for the state of Alaska, for our potential for future economic growth. And with that in mind, we're here today. The whole theme behind today is the economic impacts of early childcare and education. And we're fortunate enough to have a brand new report prepared by McKinley Research Group on behalf of Thread, that my spouse, my wife, the president of McKinley Research Group, is going to present for us today. And she'll be followed up by the, Nolan, you have a long title too. You're becoming an academic. The Executive Director of Economics and Research at the UAA Center for Economic Development. He's going to provide some remarks after Katie has a chance to present today. And so I just want to thank both of our presenters for being here, because as I mentioned, I think our household is a great metaphor for the importance of early childcare and education, in that we would not be here today if we had not figured out how to get all 3 of the boys now, if you watched the video in the beginning, there's now 3 of them, yay, to some form of childcare. So somebody's watching our kids through this whole thing. With that in mind, Katie, would you like to begin?
Well, thank you, Kevin. And as I start my presentation, I saw this morning that a few of you have your children with you today. And I wanted to say very publicly that, as Kevin said, I'm the mother of 3 boys. So for those of you who brought your children today, please join us. Please listen as we talk about this data and this importance. I can literally focus through any amount of noise at this point. So I'm thrilled to see that you're all with us today. We're going to mind meld here and go to the next slide. Great. So as Kevin said, I'm Katie Berry. I'm the president of McKinley Research Group, but I'm not, of course, the only person that works at McKinley Research Group. We're a team, a multidisciplinary team of social and economic researchers that have been operating in Alaska for the last 50 years. And I'd like to point out some team members that we have here today in the audience. We have Sylvia Craig and Moira Gallagher joining us as well. Our team has performed, we do many, many things in Alaska, and you see us wear many hats depending on what industry we're working with. We do survey research, we do feasibility studies, we do community needs assessments, economic planning, and we've conducted some of the most complex economic impact analyses in the state, including for all of these industries that you see listed here on the slides. We are so thrilled to be partners with Thread, and we've worked with them for many years on all kinds of different research, some of which you see here on this slide today. This year, we performed another edition of the household survey of families with young children. If anyone in this room can tell me what the perfect time to call and survey a mother or father of a young child is, then I will give you as much money as I can, because this is a really challenging survey to call parents and say, do you have 20 minutes to talk to me? Do you have 20 quiet minutes to tell me all about finding care for your child? But our team is so dedicated that we are able to do this because we know how important it is to really talk to families and understand their experiences. So today I'm thrilled to share with you 3 different facets of our research and our findings. We're going to try to avoid doing the percentage and data soup this morning. So as Kevin shared, all of you have a brochure on your table that will outline these numbers. So feel free to sit back, relax, don't take notes. And if you get lost in the numbers, raise your hand and say, I'm lost in the numbers, move on. Today, we're going to talk about 3 things. We're going to talk about how important early care and education services are for Alaska's labor force. We're going to talk about some barriers that families face to accessing those services. And then we're going to round it out by talking about some jobs and wages in the sector itself. So I know that this morning you've already heard a lot of people say that early care and education services are really important to Alaska's labor force. But in the next slide, I'm going to put some numbers on that for you. About 50,000 Alaskans can participate in the workforce because they have access to early care and education services. I'd love all of you to shout out, what % of Alaska's labor force do you think that is? We have no brave souls? Okay, we have some brave souls. That's 14% of Alaska's labor force. These 50,000 people that can work because they have access to early care and education services make a combined $4.6 billion in earnings, excuse me. That's 15% of the earnings from work in our state. So yeah, you better believe that a service and a sector that impacts 14% of our labor force is really important to getting Alaskans to work. This isn't just important for the overall economy. I think as many of you raise your hands in here today, I can tell we have a lot of parents here. This is important for our overall economy, and it's important for households. So for a household that's headed by a single father, They're able to make an average of $89,000 a year because they have access to these services. Households headed by single mothers can make $78,000 a year because they have these services. And for folks who are fortunate enough to have two parents in the household, where both of them can work because they have these services, they make an average of $41,000 additionally because their children are in care. And that makes a huge difference to what they can spend in our local economy. So I've said this tagline over the last several years, but early care and education is clearly everyone's business. And as we surveyed businesses over the last year, we found that more and more businesses, as Stephanie alluded to, are really recognizing how important these services are to their labor force and to their workers. Many businesses in Alaska, you will not be surprised to hear, are struggling because their workers are having childcare issues. 77% told us that their workers are struggling with absenteeism because they have childcare issues. 72% say there's some loss of productivity with their workers because of these issues. And 56% say they're struggling with turnover because their workers just cannot find childcare. Let's move to the next slide. So here's some more impacts. We know that there's those negative impacts when employers cannot find workers with stable childcare. But when businesses do invest and they do support these benefits for their employees, they've also told us through survey research that they see lots of business benefits to their businesses. That's a tongue twister. They see lower turnover and absenteeism. They find it a competitive advantage when hiring that they can say we have these benefits. They see increases in overall productivity and employee satisfaction. They say that they have a culture of trust at their workforce. And I'm a little biased, but I also think this last point is important, that they see they have more women in management roles. But the theme of today, as you've all heard, is that more help is needed. When we survey households in those precious moments when we can get mothers and fathers to talk to us between making dinner and picking up their kids, 51% of those families surveyed said that they can't fully participate in the labor force because they have childcare issues. 39% said they worked fewer hours than they would like to. 14% said they had changed jobs, job schedule, or location. 14% said they had just quit a job. And 6% said they had quit school or switched to online classes because they could not access the childcare services they need. So on one hand, we have 14% of our labor force who can participate because they have access to early care and education services. And we have a population who would love to participate more and get off the sidelines even more in our labor force if they had more early care and education services. So what are some of these barriers that families are facing when they're looking for childcare? Again, as we surveyed families, we found that 57% said it was very difficult or difficult to find early care and education services. 74% of those families said that just a lack of providers in general was the primary reason that was difficult for them. 60% said cost was a difficulty in finding care. And then 27% said quality was a barrier to them in finding the care that they wanted for their children. These services are expensive. Kevin and I have told you we have 3 children. We didn't buy a boat. But we can tell you that there have been times in our lives when our daycare bill is higher than our mortgage. And we're happy to pay it because we love our children. We love our child care providers. They provide excellent care. But we often think about the things that we could do in the economy if this was less expensive. And for some families, it's not just about the things that they could do in the economy. It's about, could they participate more in the labor force? Could they buy a bigger house? Could they have more children if these were less expensive? So for our survey research, I see I have 5 minutes remaining. We've got a lot to say in 5 minutes. Survey research finds that for families, the average that they're paying for 0 to 5-year-olds is $689 a month for care. And for 6 through 12-year-olds, that's $315 a month. The annual cost of licensed early care services is 15% of average household income in Alaska. And you can see I don't need to read off these percentages to you in the essence of time. But for single parents, this is a higher percentage of their income that they're investing so that they can work. In total, what this means is that in Alaska, each year, so setting aside one-time COVID-type relief funding, each year, about $580 million is spent on early care and education services in the state. And the majority of that is paid by families. So about $400 million paid by families each year to access these services. Now I want to turn a little bit to employment in the sector itself. We can go to the next slide. So with this $580 million spent in Alaska each year, you can see in your brochure that we list there's about 6,900 jobs directly supported in the sector. So these are folks directly providing care to children, working at child care businesses, in child care homes, etc. These child care businesses are also buying goods and services, and as they do that, they support additional jobs in the economy. So this $580 million that's spent a year supports a total of about 8,000 jobs in Alaska. What many of you know, and what's been alluded to already this morning, though, is that those folks who work directly in the child care sector often make some of the lowest wages in the state. And you can see here from this graph that folks in the child care sector make an average of about $2,400 a month. And that's comparable to positions in retail, positions in food service, as you've already heard. And while it's not displayed here, is often lower, considerably lower than other professions like kindergarten teachers who have an equal, these are tough jobs, these are intense jobs. They're jobs that require a lot of emotional labor to do, and they're often paid very low wages, which makes it very hard for providers to attract people into these positions. So in this time, I've thrown an incredible amount of numbers at you in different facets of how early care and education is impacting our economy. I know that Kevin's going to turn it over now to Nolan, and then there'll be time for more discussion.
So thank you, Katie, for that. As a fellow member of the cabal, I think it's very interesting because, again, as we all give these talks and look at the Alaska economy, I think it'd be fair to say that we often say that the economy is not weak, but maybe it's constrained by labor force issues. And so a lot of those numbers are stark when we're talking about participation, absenteeism, and ability to participate in the economy. This is a real constraint for the overall Alaska economy and really the national economy too, as we're facing demographic change, baby boomers retiring, and other things that are taking other people out of the labor force. So thank you for that, Katie. Now, with that in mind, Nolan, would you like to come up and give us your thoughts and comments on the state of childcare in the economy?
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. So I'm Nolan Cloud. I direct a unit called the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development, part of the UAA Business Enterprise Institute. And I'm somebody who has, my foot in the world of like the economics and the data and, having plenty of opportunities to show up at venues like this and opine about all kinds of things, but also somebody who tries to think really hard about what we can do about some of these challenges that we face in our economy as well. And in addition to that, I am also the parent of two adorable kids, a 2-year-old named Winston and a 4-year-old named Cecilia. So that means that I show up for things sleep deprived, frazzled, I checked my suit for peanut butter this morning, and I didn't have any, so that's good. I count that as a win. But I think, to start off with, I think it's very hard to talk about the economics of childcare without talking about this kind of really ugly reality behind the sort of financials of what a childcare center looks like. And that is the fact that childcare is very expensive. I think Katie pointed that out very well. The workers are also not paid nearly as well as they should be. So the teachers, are getting, about $15 an hour, right? And so I wanted to make a point, though, that there's this standard of affordability, that I know is more of an aspiration than something that reflects, present day realities, but the idea of 7% of income going towards childcare, that's an ideal benchmark that's been identified. And at the current cost of childcare, for one child, a family has to be making about $195,000 per year to meet that 7% threshold. Right. So if you think about that, what that means for affordability, I mean, that's a very small percentage of households could actually afford the true cost of childcare, even for one child, let alone for two or for three or for more. And then of course, why is it expensive? It's expensive because of labor costs. Childcare requires a lot of skilled people and dedicated people to be there and to get paid. And the people behind those labor costs are not paid that well, right? So we have this ugly reality of it being too expensive, and yet the workers who do the work, the teachers who do the work are not adequately paid. At the rate that they get, about $15 an hour or less than $30,000 a year, the average one-room apartment in Anchorage would consume around half or a little more than half of their total paycheck if they didn't have another income to look at. So the way that these two things are squeezed, I think, is definitely something that if there's a case to be made for public policy, I think this is it. There's no way for this to kind of work itself out. There's no way that the market is going to create more availability of childcare at a higher wage. It's simply the math of it just doesn't work that way. So I want to shift and talk about the labor force a little bit and the labor market. And this is the thing that I get asked about the most, and that I'm asked to talk about the most is why is the labor market just so tight and so strange? Why are people so scarce? And we're in Alaska now, 2 job openings for every unemployed person. I mean, so there are simply not enough bodies out there for all the jobs, in our economy. There just aren't. The reasons for that, I think, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, a lot of it has to do, the biggest part of it has to do with our changing age demographics. We have a lot more people that are into those retirement years, and we don't have as many young people just existing in our population to move into the workforce to fill all of those jobs. And I think then there's a few other things that complicate it. We've got this ugly outmigration trend in Alaska that makes things even worse. The various pandemic disruptions that are still in the process of working themselves out. And then childcare is another factor that is keeping some people, out of the workforce that would like to be in the workforce. And this is my son, Winston. He's trying to join the workforce and contribute to the solution himself by making important calls on an old broken calculator. He's seen mommy and daddy do that, and he wants to feel important too. So I think he's talking about dinosaurs or trucks. I'm not sure which. Whenever when you talk about the labor market, you still hear a lot of folks that say, well, people just don't want to work anymore, right? We all heard this, and I know that this has been rebutted a lot before, but my rebuttal to that is something like this graph. This is what's considered prime age workforce participation. So people between the ages of 25 and 54, what percent of them are either working or actively seeking work? They choose those years because you have people younger than 25 often still completing education or college or whatever. People older than 54 are, most people don't retire at that age, but they're starting to trail off. They're starting to be more of the population that's getting retired. So that group of people is actually participating at a higher rate now than they were right before the pandemic, when the labor shortage was not as bad. This is largely because of those retirements and the aging of the population. There's no surplus of laziness that suddenly spiked up and people sitting around, on their couches. I mean, this is something real. So let's talk about what could be done about that. And I think Jonathan alluded to this really well. If we look at people in those prime years who don't have kids, this is the labor force participation for men and for women. It's pretty high for both, a little bit higher for men. But after having kids, this is when they have kids under the age of 5. There's this sort of doubling down of those, what we might think of as these kind of dated gender roles that really do reassert themselves even in the present day. Men are more likely to jump into the labor force kind of with both feet. women are pulled back from it, right? So if we're talking about ways to bring folks into the economy to fill much needed roles, this is one of those opportunities. Childcare can help alleviate this. This also is something that contributes to lower earnings for the gender pay gap, right? This is something that women having to pull back from their careers lowers their earning power for the rest of their careers in a lot of cases too. So there's an important equity implication too. This is also something that's getting, I think, noticed a lot more. The National Council of Nonprofits and the 4Acre Group did this survey of nonprofit organizations asking a lot about labor and retention issues. 36% of Alaska nonprofits named childcare, lack of childcare, as something that affects their recruitment and retention issues. And that was the highest of any state out of all the states that participated in this survey nationwide. 36% of those organizations, more than a third, say that's an issue that affects their recruitment and retention. And then Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, recent survey, 58% of employers in Anchorage, mostly for-profit businesses, said that childcare services are a very important issue for the Anchorage economy. So this is something that's getting noticed, in a big way among our business community, among the organizations that are the business organizations in the state, I think. Last big point that I want to make, as a person who's an economic developer, I spend a lot of time thinking about what it is that makes a place competitive. What is it that makes a place a desirable place for people to live, for people to work, for businesses to get started, for businesses to invest? What is it that does all of those things? And there's this survey that's done of large corporations across the country each year that are looking at if the corporation's looking to expand, to relocate, open a new branch, move its headquarters. How do you decide where to do that? What place to go? What do you look for in a place? And this is the top 10 factors that they look at. The top 3 all have to do with workforce. Labor costs, which are largely a function of the availability of people. Quality of life, which is about the ability of people to be happy in a place, and the availability of skilled labor. So all 3 of these things are really about people. These rank above things like construction costs and taxes and regulation and energy. These rank above a whole bunch of things that are really critically important for businesses. The bottom line is that people matter a lot, and investments in people do have a payoff. In addition to just being good for society at large, they do have more of a financial return associated with them. And so what would it look like if Alaska had something like a New Mexico type of program where childcare is nearly universally available and affordable to lower income families? Like, what if Alaska had that issue totally solved? What would that do for our desirability as a place to live and a place to start businesses and a place to invest? And I think it could be something that would be a real game changer for us in a lot of ways. So childcare certainly has something to offer here as far as place-based, economic development goes. And so those are the observations I want to make. This is a couple of screenshots of me doing my damnedest to participate in the labor force myself, and not succeeding at it terribly well. So anyway, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Nolan. No, I was going to start with a question for Katie, but Nolan, I think maybe we'll start with you instead. So first off, thank you to both of you for your insights and everything else. We're also going to sort of open up things for audience participation. So if you do have questions or comments, please use the note cards at your table and write down whatever you'd like to ask, and raise your hand and somebody will come by and grab those. But while we're waiting for questions, first, Nolan. CED works with a lot of sectors across Alaska. Like you mentioned, you think a lot about what makes an economy grow and what can help these different sectors. How is childcare different?
Well, childcare is different in a number of ways. One is that it supports the health of so many other sectors in the economy, right? I think every industry in the state has workers, and workers are people, and people, many of them have families. Many of those families are young children, right? And so I think that it's a sector that it doesn't just exist discretely on its own as an important source of employment, which, although it is, it's also something that enables a lot of other sectors to have a healthy footprint. So I think that's probably the top distinction.
Thank you. And Katie, I've got a question for you as well. So Nolan points out that childcare is expensive, and we know it's expensive ourselves. And I think everybody at this table has experience paying a lot. But we also know that workers in the childcare sector are not paid very much. And as an economist, this raises a question, right, of where is the money going? Can you talk a little bit about what is driving this difference between what's being paid by the people purchasing childcare and what's being paid to the workers in the sector?
Sure, absolutely. I could talk your ear off about that, and I probably have at some points. So we hear this refrain, right? It's expensive for families. People are paid low in this sector, so where's the money going? Is this a story that childcare providers are getting wealthy? Is there a Scrooge McDuck of childcare providers out there? And the basic answer is no. I think all of us in this room know that Alaska is a very expensive place to live, and it's a very expensive place to do business. You can think of everything from just having a facility is expensive, heating a facility, paying for energy is expensive. But other things that folks may not think about is often, like I said in the video that started this session today, insurance is expensive. It's something that childcare providers have to provide the type of care that parents are interested in having for their children. Food services are expensive. Getting healthy, nutritious food, as Commissioner Hedberg knows, is expensive for folks to provide that level of quality. So these expenses mean that childcare providers are really stretched. And when they think about trying to pay more to their workers, they're having to consider, can families that we serve afford to pay more so we can pay more to our workers? And one plug I'll say is that our firm, McKinley Research Group, is currently working with the state of Alaska on a child care cost model, as many other states have, to quantify this and to put some numbers around those type of expenses.
Thank you. And so Nolan, you had a really interesting slide there on the changes in labor force participation for men and women post having their first child. I don't know if anybody else is as big of an economics nerd as myself, but you may have noticed the 2023 Nobel Prize in Economics went to Claudia Golden. Her work is on women's labor force participation, and she has an interesting result that the difference and potentially the gender wage gap is a result of changes in labor force participation post having a child. I've kind of got a question for both of you as a result of that long introduction. We've all had an experience trying to get a child between the 0 and 1 age bracket into childcare recently. Can you talk a little bit about how that might be different than compared to, say, a 4 or 5-year-old, somebody who's older in that bracket? And then any advice from your recent experience?
I think I'll tackle this first, because hearing two men talk about the gender pay gap in a row might be off-putting to some people. I got one woo, thanks. Stand up is hard this early in the morning. But all jokes aside, so often when we share these numbers from our household surveying, you see that families say it's very difficult to find care. And sometimes those percentages really mask the change in different age ranges and how difficult that care is to find. So for infants between, we say 0 to 1, often it's kind of 3 months and up. That's more challenging. There are fewer spots available than for a 3 or 4-year-old. So this, often I go to baby showers. I love going to baby showers, and people ask for advice, and people are giving all kinds of advice, and mine is always, have you found childcare yet? Because that's really the first thing that you're going to want to do. You're going to want to find childcare for your baby if you want to participate in the labor force. And then you want to treat those providers really well, because they're going to be really important to your family, as Jonathan said, for a long time.
Yes. I did have the experience of waiting a really long time to get my daughter into childcare. We waited over a year to get into daycare, and it was during the pandemic. Capacity really fell, and so we had my wife and I both working from home, juggling a young one back and forth, and it became untenable at a certain point. You're not going to be able to get any kind of work done. Haven't had the experience of trying to get an older kid into childcare, but I mean, I know that I know what Katie said to be true, though, that infants, it's a much tougher for child care providers to provide for infants, because they cost more, right? Because you have to have more workers per kid. I think, what is it, 4 4 kids per teacher, right? So it makes it much more difficult in order to sustain that. And then and I think it's something that is a very big problem. Infants are especially the big hurdle there. Not much I can expand on the gender wage gap, but I think that it is absolutely something that is an ongoing sort of inequity, I think, in our society that still is there.
So I've got an audience question on sort of the theme of inequalities and maybe policy, so what we can actually do. Oftentimes when we discuss policy solutions, we talk a bit about changing prices directly through subsidies or other economic levers. But are there other policies out there, potentially changing minimum wages or other direct cash transfers that might be considered? And what's the difference between those two things?
I'll step into this, and maybe this isn't, raise your hand if you ask the question and I'm going in the wrong direction for you. But part of the work that McKinley Research Group is doing now on childcare costs will look at that subsidy and different arrangements that can be made to use the limited resources that the state and that the state has to subsidize that. Going out on a limb here, something that our firm has not researched, but I kind of as an economist can think about, changing the minimum wage may or may not help. As I said, when childcare providers and businesses are looking to pay their employees more, what they're thinking about is, can our families actually bear this cost? So imposing a change on them that families can't bear may or may not have the intended outcome. The childcare providers, they don't want to pay low wages. They want to support their employees. They want to have employees that stay with their organizations for a long time. But weighing if their families can support those costs is a real concern.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think some of the ideas that I do hear talked about to lower the cost of care are fairly unpalatable when we're talking about things like reducing regulations or changing the ratios that are required so that one teacher can watch more kids, or doing anything that might lower wages, or I think or reduce qualifications. I think those are all things that my kids to be that trusts my kids with people all day long while I'm working 5 days a week. I certainly don't find those suggestions to be good. I don't have the best sense for what types of public funding, what mechanisms make the most sense, I think, but it does seem like to bridge that gap between labor costs and affordability, where changing one does something bad to the other one, I think is something that really can only work out, I think, with some amount of public money that makes that possible, so that those costs can be lower and so that the workers, the teachers, can get paid something more reasonable. I think the only way to do that is with some amount of public funding. I don't think there's a magic market mechanism that can just make that work.
And I'm going to jump in, actually, Nolan, that made me think of something else, that the levers and the mechanisms that might be needed most may not be a one-size-fits-all for our state. So another thing that is kind of papered over sometimes in all of these numbers and statistics is that there are really different things going on in rural Alaska and urban Alaska. So rural Alaska, 87% of households that we surveyed said that the lack of childcare at all is their barrier to finding these services. So it's not necessarily they face high costs as well, but there's just fewer providers and much less availability in rural Alaska. Some things that they may face from a cost perspective are there may not be a facility or a building that they can use that is appropriate for childcare that kind of meets the qualifications thereof. Whereas in urban Alaska, there may be a facility that you can use, but you may be struggling more with your labor force and getting the number of people that you need to show up to work. So these solutions may or may not be kind of statewide silver bullet.
So just a quick comment. As somebody who's tried to control a pack of like 6 kids under 5 with hockey sticks, the care ratios make a lot of sense. And we had to fix some things after that. They love that game. We've got one more question too, going back to workforce participation. Somebody's asked, when DC provided childcare, the gap between male and female workforce participation was greatly reduced. Is this something that we could expect to happen in general? Is this a magic bullet?
So the availability of childcare in general, is it a magic bullet? I would say, I don't believe that anything is ever a magic bullet, really, right? But I think that of the options that are available, of the potential policy levers that could change some of the dynamics that contribute to the reduced workforce participation for women with children and the subsequent wage gaps that come from that, I think that childcare is probably the most obvious and the most workable type of solution for that. I don't think that it's going to wipe that out completely, but I do think that it probably has the most contribute of all the options we could potentially consider.
And if I can get one more quick question, I think I have time for. Katie, I've got one about the specifics of the study itself. A few folks, we've got a couple people who've asked different versions of this question, so I apologize if I don't get it right as I'm trying to meld everything together. Please feel free to come ask questions after. But there's differences between including the cost of full-time care versus part-time care when we talk about the cost of childcare. Can you talk a little bit about the decision of how that was incorporated in the study and what that might mean for the results?
Sure. So that's a spot on observation that if you're, for instance, paying for before and after care for your kindergartner, that cost is going to be really different than paying for full-time care for your infant. So the numbers that you see represented in the economic impact report are averages over all of those different care types. So certainly if you look at something like the Alaska market rate study that the CCPO puts out in partnership with ICER, you'll see that individual providers are often charging more. But what these averages from our study show is also not care in licensed homes, or not licensed homes, not licensed care providers. So we're averaging all types of paid care that families are accessing here. And that's a real range from maybe someone in your neighborhood that takes care of your baby on a less formal basis, but you're still paying for that type of care. And I'm always happy again to talk anyone's ear off about the study, the averages, the percentages. So feel free to give me a call or email anytime.
I'm going to throw this last one up to the group because I like this question. If you watched the video in the beginning, that was our family and our discussion. We talked a little bit about how the cost of childcare impacted not just our labor force participation decisions, but the size of our family. We're in a world now where people are talking about birth rates that are below replacement rates, and we're talking a lot about healthy families. As economists, more broadly, maybe unrelated to this study, do you think that the cost of childcare is impacting the decision of young people to have kids?
Anecdotally, I can say absolutely. As I talk to women in my age range all over, I often hear the story of, well, my mother-in-law asked when we're going to do another one, when we're going to have another one. And I told her, if you pay for childcare. This is literally something multiple women have told me. Statistically, I can't say with certainty that is, and I know that there's certainly more research to be done there, but anecdotally, that's something that I hear all over the place.
I am not sure about. I'm not totally sure. I think I think that for a lot of if I have my anecdotes and my experience and people that I've known, I think that a lot of people discover the realities of childcare after they have a child or when they're already pregnant, and then they're like, oh wow, this is a thing. So I don't know how much rational planning goes into it. I don't think that I had much of a sense for the realities of it, to be totally honest. I knew about childcare being difficult only in sort of a detached way before I had kids. So I'm not totally sure. I do think that quite a few countries, like especially in Western Europe with declining populations, have looked at all kinds of ways that they can make that they can encourage people to have more kids. Most of those policies have struggled to gain traction. So I don't know if it's about if it allows people to have more kids, like in an aggregate big picture way or not, but I do know that it allows people to put more resources into the kids that they have and to produce better outcomes for them and for their families. And I think that's the most important thing.
I just got to sign. We have a couple more minutes than I expected, so that's good. Let's talk a little bit more too about the flexibility option too. You mentioned part-time care can be pre and post kindergarten, and we've talked a bit about absenteeism. When it comes to flexibility and matching schedules and things like that, how much does variation and options in childcare matter as far as reducing workforce absenteeism, increasing participation, and is it the flexibility or is it access at all that matters?
I think the short answer is both. They both matter. I think anybody in this room who's ever had a child or had a child that you wanted to have care provided for, you absolutely have to be comfortable with that type of care, especially like Kevin and I, who we have a new baby this year, and you're handing over your tiny baby to someone. That's the most important thing in your life, and you want whatever type of care you're paying for or arranging to fit with your family's family and to be comfortable for you. So it's not only child care centers that are important, but licensed homes or even more some of that less formal care that can be really important for families as they're trying to find the fit that's right for them, that works with their budget, that works with their family's lifestyle, but also works with the schedule that they actually work on.
Yeah, well, I guess one point that I'd make that's kind of related to that is that I think one thing that's different about Alaska also is that about 60% of people who live in Alaska were born somewhere else, and what that means in part is that there are a lot of people who have kids here in Alaska that don't have the support system of siblings, of grandparents, right, or of other sort of extended family. My wife and I are in a really fortunate situation where we do have grandparents here and siblings here, aunts and uncles, right, that can be backup childcare for us. But I think that means that a lot more people in Alaska, I think, are probably dependent on sort of like an institutional solution, right, on a more formal type of solution, and that's something that is different, and we don't have the. So the flexibility of like people who might need part-time care or off-hours care, evening care, weekend care, those people seem to have a very tough time here, I think, with finding those kinds of options.
I think that's an important insight. Anecdotally, we have friends who just left, and one of the drivers was they were working a third job, piecing together childcare so they could do their other two jobs, which is hard for anybody. And so that's going to wrap up our second session. I want to thank both Katie Berry from McKinley Research Group and Nolan Clouda from CED for your time and your insights.